Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 18th installment of Please Join Me. This is Joe Traina. I have a guest today of prodigious talent. He is the consummate jazz artist. He plays 9 instruments at my counting, and I'm delighted to say that I've worked with him extensively, especially on my last project, that he was graciously enough to make himself available to be part of. Tip of the hat, folks. And his work on that is ever swinging and really adds a wonderful flavor and musical nuance to my band and the arrangements by the inimitable Pete McGuinness. Dan Willis rolled into New York City in a loaded down, I love this, loaded down Dodge Shadow on a crisp fall day in 1992, just days after his 24th birthday. Because I have a cinematic mind, I see this coming through the mist in slow motion. So I think it was great. Dan arrived on the scene fresh from Eastman. He wanted to take New York by storm, and actually, he certainly did over the years. Dan has worked with the Birdland Big Band, played with Michael Brecker, Roland Vasquez, John Hollenbeck, Kenny Wheeler, and Ted Nash of the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra. Dan took the stage at Carnegie Hall as a 21-year-old with the Eastman Philharmonia. And in 1993, after moving to New York, he returned to play the tenor sax on that very stage. Dan also, a few months after moving to New York in 93, returned to play tenor sax on that very stage, and it was the setting for a performance with Itzhak Perlman and Chita Rivera. Dan has worked extensively on Broadway and been a musician accompanying the shows of Thoroughly Modern Millie, West Side Story, Book of Mormon, and others. He has appeared on The Rosie O'Donnell Show. He has appeared with Barry Manilow on David Letterman. He has also, and notably, produced his own body of work. His first 2 CDs, Quartet and Hand to Month, focused on pushing more traditional jazz into new territory. Dan has also produced and performed on 2 versions of the Satie project with his group called the Velvet Gentlemen, and they debuted at spots like New York's Birdland and the Cornelia Cafe. Dan has been on tour extensively around the world. He's been to Europe, he's been to Japan, he's been to Australia, and he has a new project out called, let me see if I have this right now, The Monk Project. Is that right, Dan?
That is correct, sir. Yes,
okay.
The Monk
The
Project.
Monk Project, and I'm going to let him tell you all about that and about his new recording, and he can speak about, of course, anything he'd like. Dan, how you doing today?
I'm well, thank you, and thanks for having me. And I've been looking forward to this for some days now since we first started talking about it. So the Monk Project all began, I was interested in understanding Monk's style, and specifically his chordal voicings, rather than what I had been doing up until that point was, calling a Monk tune at a jam session, and, thinking that I knew the melody pretty well and the chord changes that have become standardized over the years. But I wanted to go back to the set of transcriptions that I had that one of my professors at Eastman had done, Mr. Bill Dobbins, who's a wonderful musician and educator, and he had transcribed, I believe, all of the Monk compositions as they appear in their original form on the original recordings, whether it be Riverside or Blue Note, what have you, Prestige. And so I took these transcriptions and sat down with the recordings, and I wanted to start learning them, tried playing them slowly at the piano. And I soon came to the realization that because Monk's chord voicings are so specific to his style of playing, that it might be interesting to, much like with the Bach cello suites, play those voicings in an arpeggiated fashion on the saxophone. So sitting down with 60 compositions, the idea first was, where do I begin? And I'd come across, I think it was on Facebook, someone had posted a list of most favorite Monk recordings or Monk compositions. I thought, oh, okay, I agree with the ones that they listed. And the more I'm looking at this list, I thought, you know, most of these selections all appear on one album. And so I decided to sit down with Hackensack, Arenell, Epistrophe, Crepuscule with Nelly, Crisscross, Rhythmaning, Pananica, and Think of One. And that was my goal, was to arrange all of these songs as a solo saxophonist would present them. And they at first kind of started out as an etude, and because I was playing through the chords so slowly, I wanted to get them in a more performance type setting and be able to perform them, you know, in a recital or record them. So I decided that what I was going to have to do was treat the left hand of his accompaniment to his melody in a more ornamentation style. So I was going to have to move through the chords a lot quicker than how I was initially playing them, which was quite slowly as eighth notes. So then it became basically a way of tightening this whole process up and making it sound better and making it sound like the actual composition, as opposed to when I was first starting out, which was very slowly going through and it almost was unrecognizable. But from working, and this was over the course of a number of years, you know, picking one song and really trying to get it figured out how it was going to work on the saxophone, work within the range of the saxophone, because Monk's covering closer to 4 octaves or more on some of these. And that, you know, one thing leads to another. Then the idea was these were really fun to play a cappella. Now, if I looked really closely at the way Monk was playing solo piano versus the way he plays in a trio or quartet, is there much of a difference? And what I kind of decided on was the fact that he plays very soloistically, even when he's in his quartet. You know, he's cranking out the bass notes, he's playing a very stride type of fashion. So there wasn't that much difference. So I thought, okay, if I take my approach to this now and put it in my quartet, what will happen? What will that sound like? And I liked the way it sounded, and we just kept going with that and refining that idea over the years and playing it out. And each time I played it, I would decide that I was going to leave something out or add something here or there and get it to where I thought it was more acceptable or pleasurable to listen to. And that was the process. And that, quite honestly, happened over a number of years. I want to say it was close to 5 years before I really was serious about sitting down and recording these. And we're very happy with the way it turned out. It features quite a bit of Pete McCann and Ron Oswansky, and the rest of the band is Evan Gregor on the bass and John Medham on the drums, and my two guest artists, Kermit Driscoll on the electric bass. So on a couple of numbers, we actually have two basses. And on one number, that trio with Ian Froman, Kermit Driscoll, myself, and Pete McCann on Think of One. And on Think of One, I decided to take everything yet one more step further and bring the sound of the electronic wind instrument, also known as the iwi, into the mix and see how that would work. And I was really happy with it. It was similar to the approach that Michael Brecker was using on his compositions and recordings from the late 80s, where I'm taking the melody and a reconstructed version of Monk's chord voicings and making a line out of it, and using a reharmonization on the iwi, and that was a lot of fun, and that's something that I'm going to explore a little bit more on the next recording. But yeah, that's the Monk project. It went over, again, a number of years, and every time we come back to these compositions, they kind of evolve a little bit further with our familiarity of it, and just having fun with these compositions, because they have a very almost simple, childlike, fun melody to a lot of them, but are also a little bit more complex than the simplicity that you hear in the melody, whether it be in the form, like epistrophe, or some are a little bit more blues influenced, like Crisscross or Hackensack. Some are a little bit more classic ballad approach, like Arenelle or Pananica. So we had a variety of different avenues to pursue with this music, and yeah, it's always going to be a part of me, Monk's music, and I've already been thinking about what might be the follow-up to the Monk project, if there might be a Monk 2 project, much like with the Satie music. I finished the first album and realized that there were still a number of Satie compositions that I wanted to explore. So yeah, we'll see where that takes me. And this was also, with this recording, me putting it out myself on my own record label, Bell Avenue Records, and that's been exciting, starting up my own label, which features my music, and that's probably the way I'll continue to do things in the future. It's a lot faster of a process. I don't have to wait in line with other artists on a label, and I can put it out when I would like to put it out, and not have too much outside influence on the decision making. And that's been a really positive thing, and a new thing to learn. It's, running a small business. So yeah.
Yes. Well, I have my own experience with that. And yes, I really like to maintain artistic control over the whole project. It can be more costly. However, there are benefits that I think outweigh.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. And, of course, I always have another opinion to run things by with my engineer, Jim Kurzweil, who also has helped me produce a number of these projects, and I trust his ears and sensibility. And so not totally going it alone, but mostly alone.
Yes. Okay. Well, sure. These are collaborative efforts, and as well they should be, and that's where you get your best results. I want to harken back, if I may. You play many instruments, as I mentioned when I introduced you, and you
Yeah,
just mentioned one prominently in this project called the iwi. And there may be people out there who don't know what that instrument is and its origins. And I'd like you, please, to speak a little bit about it, why it appeals to you, what kind of textures and what kind of mood that you get from it. So please, would you elaborate?
sure. Yeah, so the EWI, that stands for electronic wind instrument. And that was an instrument that was invented by a gentleman named Niles Steiner back in the 70s. And he is a trumpet player, and he came up with what he calls the EV, the electronic valve instrument, which is slightly different, but the same premise where with the wind you are controlling an electronic tone. So over the years, he's developed that idea and that instrument, and he started building a woodwind version of his EVI and made the EWI for a number of people on the West Coast. Joel Peskin comes to mind, and a number of other wonderful musicians. Judd Miller is another EVI musician who I've learned a lot from, and he worked very closely with Michael Brecker. Michael Brecker probably has had the biggest influence on the world with the EWI. The thing that is a lot of fun about the EWI is that it can pretty much become whatever you can imagine you would like it to do. It has an 8-octave range, so that immediately, playing a woodwind instrument where you're playing roughly 2.5, 3 octaves, in some situations, maybe 4 octaves, but to be able to run up and down an instrument with 8 octaves, also to play chords, is very exciting. And there's just no end to what you can do with the instrument, whether it be playing samples, emulating other instruments. Nowadays, there are great software plugins where you can emulate instruments, synthesizers from as far back as the early 70s till now. And so it's basically like having a larger palette of colors to play around with. And that in turn kind of inspires different ideas for compositions, and it kind of redefines my role in let's say a quartet, because maybe I might be playing a bass part, and maybe I might be playing chords, or maybe I might be doing textural percussive type things. So suddenly with the EWI, I'm not merely playing the melody and soloing. I might be playing the entire time during the performance of a number. So it's just fun to put myself in a different role, and whatever that role is, I can redefine it how I want and explore different avenues. And it's a lot of fun. I kind of make the analogy that it was a great substitution for my love of video games as a child growing up. That's kind of silly, but the fun thing again is being able to play in a saxophone or a woodwind type manner on a much larger scale. So yeah, that and all the different people that I've met playing the EWI. I've been working very closely with a gentleman named George Whitty, who worked very closely with Michael Brecker with programming and also producing a number of his Grammy Award-winning albums. And so that's been really a lot of fun to learn from him. And like I said, Judd Miller is also was a very close friend of Michael's and worked very closely with him with his sounds on his EWI. And I've gotten to know Niall Steiner a little bit through his nephew, Mark Steiner, who's also a fine EVI player and programmer. So it's a lot of fun getting out of the regular community of New York musicians, and with the internet and Zoom and Skype, I'm connected to people all over the world and can share information and ideas, and that's been a lot of fun.
Well, look, obviously, you're always looking for ways to stretch, to push, to explore, and you have this musically inquisitive nature, which, in my view, beyond what you might call more traditional or avant-garde. I don't like to use labels, but you're trying.
Well, that's a good way of putting it, because I quite often ask myself, how did that person do that? Why am I so drawn to that sound? Why do I love that? Why is that? How did you get there? And boundaries in music, I never really had much time for. Growing up, listening and playing classical music with the oboe and that training and learning jazz, they were always going simultaneously. So and jazz led me to playing in different types of groups that would need horn sections or rock and roll sax solo or world music type stuff. And boundaries in music just doesn't really interest me. I'm more interested in finding out more about other musicians and music, and then subsequently, I think, myself, perhaps.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that's a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask you now. You said that you grew up playing the oboe and a lot of classical music, and I want to ask you, please, what draws you specifically to the music of Satie? And I watched a clip before we began today on YouTube where you say, and I'm going to try to draw you out a bit, that performing the music of Erik Satie and exploring it taught you more about yourself. And I was hoping that you might elaborate on that. You took Satie, classical composer, which you also mentioned is somewhat lyrical and even a little childlike, I think is a word that you also describe, which you use for monk too. So I think that kind of thing appeals to you. And so tell us about your delving into that particular music and what it has done to maybe have you explore things about yourself.
Well, Satie's music I was familiar with a little bit growing up, going to the Eastman School of Music and going to piano recitals. Quite often you would hear the famous First Gymnopédie played in piano recitals because it's such a beautiful melody. And I think over the years, you've probably heard that composition in particular, whether it be in film scores or for TV jingles, or Blood, Sweat, and Tears actually quotes part of it in one of their compositions. So that music was always a little bit with me, and I didn't really get into it until later, which, believe it or not, I was involved in a car accident almost 20 years ago. And it was the type of car accident where I was rear-ended and I had suffered whiplash. And the result of that was some really significant headaches that went on for the better part of a year, in addition to back pain. And my wife had recommended that I go see a acupuncturist. And up until that point, I had no experience with acupuncture or going to a chiropractor for that matter. And so I went to visit an acupuncturist, Sheila Mason, right here next door in Englewood, New Jersey. And she's a really lovely woman. I've continued my relationship with her for the past 20 years. And so I'm laying on the table, and the needles are administered, and she, without asking, put on some music. And she put on a selection of Eric Satie's piano compositions, which really blew me away, because now this is the first moment where I'm actually beginning to have some relief from all these headaches and pain in my back. And I'm listening to these really beautiful melodies. And as I'm laying there, I'm beginning to have these really amazing, wonderful thoughts about, well, that song is actually an extended song form, not necessarily 32 bars, but maybe 34. And then the next selection, I thought, wow, that almost sounds like it could be an Ornette composition. And then the next thing I'm listening to, wow, that almost has a hint of the blues in it. So I started having ideas of performing these songs and how I would arrange them for my own group. So that began my interest in Eric Satie. And so I bought as many piano books as I could find with his compositions in them and recordings. And that exploration of his music was a lot of fun. And again, it helped my piano playing. And that was my first experience with taking a classical selection and doing a jazz treatment of it, and asking yourself the question, why would you do something like that to this composition that already exists perfectly fine on its own? And it was thinking about what was my point of view looking at this, and what I would want to do, and what my personality would be lending this in a jazz forum. So it was a bit of a risk, and going out on, a little bit of the ledge, so to speak, certainly musically. And you run the risk of possibly ruffling a few feathers doing such a radical treatment of loved classical music. So it was a bit of a gamble and an exploration, and it was a situation where I had to really trust myself and my opinions on what we were going to do, that it was going to work, and not be something that I would be regretful that could happen. So that's what I meant by learning something about myself, which was trusting in my opinion of what this could be and where we're going to go with it. And if I hadn't done that with the Satie music, perhaps I wouldn't have done that with the Monks music. And the other aspect of that is getting into someone else's compositions that deeply, and studying them and spending that much time with them it's almost, I like to think of it as having a conversation with the composer, because you start to find patterns of behavior, patterns of intervals, harmonies, voicings that they seem to be drawn to, which makes me draw my own conclusions about these are the things that they like, and how can I bring those things that they like, since I like them, into my own compositions. So that's, in a very long-winded way of answering your question, how I think that both of these composers helped me learn about myself.
You're from a musical family, I read, yes?
Yes, yeah. Both my grandparents were musicians. My grandfather was a violinist, also played piano. My grandmother played piano. They both ran a music store, among other things that they did, which was, primarily teaching.
And where was this now, please?
This was in Niagara Falls, New York.
Ah,
And so they owned a building, and the front part of it was a storefront where they had their music store. The rest of it was their home, with apartments upstairs and downstairs. And so they had a music store, which by the time I was born, that music store was already kind of closed up. They were still teaching privately, but they weren't doing the retail anymore. But what is interesting is when we would go to visit, they still had the store with all of the instruments set up. So it was a lot of fun as a small child. And I remember being quite young. I want to say possibly 4 years old, and walking around this very dusty music store with all of these amazing instruments still set up, on their stands or in the cases, in the display cases. And it was kind of like it was frozen in time, but we were allowed to walk through there. And of course, as soon as you start touching something, your grandmother's yelling at you, "Don't touch that." So I think, growing up in a musical family, my father was a musician. Both my brothers are musicians. It was always very clear to me that in my mind, I was already a musician as a child. There was never the thought like, maybe one day I'll be a musician. It was, we are musicians. And that wasn't like an egotistical thing or anything. It was just, we are a family of musicians. So, so my father was an educator. He went to Eastman School of Music as well and studied composition with Howard Hanson. So again, from a very young age, I was hearing about the Eastman School and Dr. Howard Hanson from a very early age, and learning about their jazz program that they had there, which I didn't realize at that time. Their jazz program was for graduate students. And if you were really good as an undergrad, you could perform with the graduate students, but there was no jazz undergrad degree as they have now. So here I was as a kid thinking I'm listening to, younger college students, and these were, very well-established musicians. And that explains why they were such great writers and great musicians. And my father had a very good friend who ran Mark Records, which was out of Buffalo, New York, and he would get very large stacks of these records of the Eastman Saxology Group, the Eastman Jazz Ensemble, the Wind Ensemble, Philharmonia. So I was naturally drawn to the Eastman School of Music and had wanted to audition there, and I'd been studying classical oboe since age 12. After some failed attempts at piano and drums. So yeah, I started learning the oboe. I think it was and 2 weeks later, I got handed a saxophone. So my father had decided that I would learn both instruments at the same time. He being a musician and working in the Buffalo area, he knew that I wanted to learn the saxophone. A very close family friend of ours was Don Menza, and he was and continues to be a very big influence on me as a musician and as a dear friend. So I wanted to play the saxophone like Don Menza, and my father asked his musician friends on gigs. He said, "So you guys double, you play flute and clarinet. Which of those doubles is the hardest to learn? Because if my son learns saxophone, I want him to learn to double." And they said, "Well, actually, the oboe is the hardest double." So I said, "Great." So he comes home and says, "You're going to start learning saxophone. You're going to study with John Sedola. But first we're going to get you an oboe." And I thought, wow, okay. So at that point, I really wasn't clear on what an oboe was. I actually thought that in those Bugs Bunny cartoons, when he was doing the snake charmer thing, that was an oboe. So I thought, okay, that's really cool. So I thought I was getting to learn what was either a Chennai or a sham, or so I get handed an oboe, and I immediately fell in love with it. And of course, the very first thing I tried to play on it was harmonic minor melody, da da dee da da, that type of thing. And so yeah, I was always playing the oboe and the saxophone together. So I had my classical oboe lessons with Rodney Pierce of the Buffalo Philharmonic, and saxophone with John Sedola, who was also Don Menza's teacher and taught a number of great jazz musicians in Buffalo. So I was very lucky to have very good teachers at a very young age, and that love just kept repeating itself over and over, and took me to the Eastman School of Music. And from there, I was meeting a lot of people from the New York City area, and wanted to move to the New York area. And it's been a great time ever since. And I've met a lot of different kinds of people and traveled the world and taught quite a bit. And being a musician is something that I always assumed I was going to do, but I don't take it for granted, and I love doing it. And to this day, I'm still trying to learn how to play the blues better, like we all are.
So now, tell us about, we're going to play a musical selection from your new project.
The Monk Project. I think we were going to play Hackensack.
Yes.
So this is me and the Velvet Gentleman. The Velvet Gentleman name comes from the Satie Project. So when Eric Satie wasn't composing, he would go out to the park and see the kids playing, and he would sit on the park bench, and all the kids made up a nickname for him. And he always wore a velvet jacket. So they nicknamed him the Velvet Gentleman. So I took that name and made us, as the quartet, the Velvet Gentlemen. And that name stuck, and that's it's been some 20 years now. We've been the Velvet Gentlemen, and now the Velvet Gentlemen are playing the music of Monk, and we're playing Hackensack, one of my favorite Thelonious Monk compositions, as I live in Teaneck, New Jersey, and Hackensack is just across the river, right next door. And Hackensack was one of those suburbs of New York City where a lot of people moved to and lived, and it's a really big, very diverse town now. And it's got a funky side to it. And I thought if we were going to look at the composition Hackensack now, and when I recorded this in the year 2020, how would we best reflect Hackensack now? And this is what we came up with.
Okay. Before we play it, would you be kind enough to reintroduce the members of the Velvet Gentlemen?
Of course. I'm going to look at the back of the album just so I don't leave anyone off, because I've been able to do that in the past. So Pete McCann on electric guitar, Rana Swansky on Fender Rhodes, Evan Gregor on bass, and John Medham on drums.
Okay, folks, this is Dan Willis and the Velvet Gentlemen playing Thelonious Monk's composition, Hackensack. Masterful. Obviously, Dan Willis' talent is, as I've said before, prodigious. I would even go as far as to say he's colossal. And I want to thank him for spending this time with me today. And I'm proud to call him my friend, and he has mentored me, and he has taught me, and I have been delighted to be associated with him. His music is something that everyone should listen to very closely because he explores the compositions, he explores by way of his arranging, he plays numerous instruments, each with equal virtuosity.
Monk Project is currently available on all of your finer media streams. We are also beginning a radio promotion campaign April 1st, and that's through our good friends at Groove Marketing. And that will be on radio stations across the United States, worldwide on the web and satellite radio. So I'm very excited about that. So you can hear us on the radio, or you can find us on Spotify, Pandora, iTunes, Tidal. If you get a chance, drop me a line. I'm on Facebook, and I would love to speak with you about either Eric Satie or Thelonious Monk or my own compositions. And Joe, let me take a minute to thank you very much for having me today. This has been a lot of fun. I always love speaking with you about a number of different topics. Again, this is really a lot of fun.
Well, again, I'm glad you're able to make it, and the feeling is pari-mutual, I'm insured. I got that from Leo Gorsi. I only quote the best. And also to my audience, again, please support the arts. Please listen in to master musicians like Dan Willis. This has been a very challenging time, especially for performing artists in the last year, and they really need and require support. I'm a strong advocate for the arts, I think, in this country, unfortunately, and I've spoken about this in the past. It's not as revered and promoted as I think it should be by some of the real movers and shakers, but we'll all do what we can to continue to make art, especially in challenging times. And I wish Dan only the best. I encourage you folks out there, once again, to check out Dan Willis. He is an erudite, thoughtful, multi-talented, wonderful human being, and I think he will enhance your lives on several levels. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, this is Joe Traina. I thank you for tuning in to Please Join Me, and I hope that you will listen in again for the next installment. We've been talking to Dan Willis, and I wish you all well out there. Be safe, and thanks very much.
You've been listening to Please Join Me with Joe Traina. Be sure to listen anywhere you get your podcasts. Keep up with joetrainamusic.com for news and new episodes. You can find Joe's latest recording, Tip of the Hat, on all major streaming services and wherever fine music is sold. This episode was produced by Caroline Voigt.